Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast and our celebration of Pollinator Week. Beekeeping Today podcast, presented by Bee Culture Magazine, is your source for beekeeping news, information, and entertainment. I'm Jeff Ott.
And I'm Kim Flottam.
Today's sponsor is Global Patties. They're a family-operated business that manufactures protein supplement patties for honeybees. It's a good time to think about honeybee nutrition. Feeding your hives protein supplement patties will ensure that they produce strong and healthy colonies by increasing brood production and overall honey flow. Now is a great time to consider what type of patty is right for your area and your honeybees. Global offers a variety of standard patties as well as custom patties to meet your needs. No matter where you are, Global is ready to serve you out of their manufacturing plants in Airdrie, Alberta, and in Butte, Montana, or from distribution depots across the continent. Visit them today at www.globalpatties.com.
That's right. We want to thank Bee Culture Magazine for continuing their presenting sponsorship of this podcast. Bee Culture has been the magazine for American beekeeping since 1873. Subscribe to Bee Culture today, and while you're there, check out Bee Culture's Beekeeping, your first 3 years, a quarterly magazine for beginning beekeepers. Additionally, we want to thank Better Bee for sponsoring our Pollinator Week series of podcasts. Better Bee, beekeepers serving beekeepers at www.betterbee.com. We also want to thank 2 Million Blossoms as sponsor of this episode. 2 Million Blossoms is a quarterly magazine dedicated to protecting all pollinator insects, both wild and managed, before they disappear. Learn more on our Season 2, Episode 9 podcast with editor and our guest co-host, Kirsten Trainer, and from visiting www.2millionblossoms.com, and that is with a number 2. Hey everybody, welcome to our second day of Pollinator Week series of special shows. Yesterday's, if you missed it, we talked with Lori Adams and Kelly Rourke of Pollinator Partnership. Today we talk with Dr. Chip Taylor. Pretty good series, huh, Kim?
So far it is. Yesterday was fun. Lori and her crew are really a bunch of ambitious people. They got their fingers in a lot of things, and this week is one of them. But Chip Taylor, Monarch Watch, I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, Chip Taylor is really good. You know, you'll know. You sent me down to Mexico with him back in, I don't know, 93 or something like that. And boy, he not only does he know about monarchs, he has his hands literally at times with before the Africanized honeybees came up through North America. He's very knowledgeable. This is going to be a good interview.
Yeah, the Africanized honeybee thing was good for him for a while, but he saw the handwriting on the wall and decided to leave them go and picked up with monarchs. So here we are today.
All right,
full circle, Jeff. Full circle.
Fantastic. Hey, you know, it is Pollinator Week, and you remember last year, or is it Season 2 or Season 1? I can't remember. I'll have to check that out. We had Peter Nelson on and his movie, The Pollinators.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah.
And it's come back, isn't it?
Yeah, it has. It's a fantastic movie, and it was available through private screenings and special screenings through different groups around the country. But now he has made it available on all the digital streaming services such as Apple TV and Google Play. And all of the big ones, you can watch it on your big home screen TV there, Kim.
Yeah, I'm, well, let's see. I've got nothing to do tonight. I think I'm going to sit back and watch.
Yeah, it's a great film. The film explores the many challenges beekeepers and their bees face as they travel the country and talks with all the farmers and scientists and chefs and academics along the way to really give a broad perspective of the threats to beekeepers. It's a really, really good movie, and the photography, the cinematography from our friend of the podcast, Peter Nelson, is phenomenal. It's just a delight to watch.
We were lucky to get him when that film first came out, and I've gone back and listened to it a couple of times.
Yeah, he's good. I encourage all of our listeners to check it out on your streaming service of your choice. All right, well, let's get into our interview with Chip.
Okay.
With us right now is Chip Taylor. Chip Taylor is the founder and director of Monarch Watch. Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast, Chip, and our Pollinator Week series.
Well, thank you very much. Pleased to be here, Jeff.
Well, it's good to see you again, Chip. I've harvested my milkweed seed this morning.
Well, we can certainly do that. I can tell you where to put those seeds.
Good.
Chip Taylor is known for a lot of reasons, but today we're talking about his role in Monarch Watch. A lot has been going on. It was in the early 90s you started that program, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It was 1992, and I was still working on the so-called neotropical African bees, commonly known as killer bees at that time, but I could see that research was going to come to an end. So I started a project in 1992, which was a simple tagging project, tagging monarch butterflies. And we didn't call it Monarch Watch the first year. We used the tagging technology that had been developed by Fred and Nora Urquhart in Canada. And we did that for the first year. And then we had such a great response to that program that we decided to carry it on. It was just a kind of a test program. In 1992, we put out 2 news releases. One went out to the Des Moines Register, another one went down to Dallas, and each of those pleas, which ended up on front pages of newspapers in each of those cities, each of those pleas generated about 500 responses of people willing to tag monarch butterflies. And we go, holy smokes. I mean, in 1 year with just 2 news releases, we had about 1,000 people involved. And we said, we've got something here. We've captured something. And one of the partners that I had at that time said, you have to get schools involved. And I said, no, schools aren't going to work. The kids can't produce the kind of data we need from a tagging program. Boy, was I wrong. We got a lot of schools and a lot of teachers involved, and the teachers were incredibly enthusiastic. The students were incredibly enthusiastic. And the effect of this was that we had a program that we knew was catching on, and we decided to call it Monarch Watch. We quickly learned that we had to keep morphing the tagging technology to kind of make it better and better and better. And in 1997, we developed a new tag, a circular tag that's placed on the underside of the hind wing of the butterfly. It uses a special adhesive, and that just completely changed the program from something that was kind of limping along to something that became very, very successful. And to date, going from that early start in 1992 to the present, we've tagged about 2.2 million monarchs over those years, as our volunteers have. And we've got about 20,000 recoveries down in Mexico alone. And that's produced a tremendous database, which we're mining now and writing a whole series of papers based on that data that's been acquired over the years through the work of a lot of volunteers. So our vision initially was that we would learn a lot more about this migration than just the origins of the butterflies. We were interested in that, of course, but we're more interested in the dynamics of the migration. And that's where we're really focusing on.
Well, that's an incredible story. So why did you start this program? What was to be learned?
Well, I started out a couple of years earlier working with graduate students. And I was working with graduate students in a field ecology course. And it was kind of an experimental field ecology course where the students had to solve problems and had to do some original science. I mean, it wasn't just a textbook sort of thing. It was get out there in the field and let's solve some problems. This takes off from my experience working with OTS in Costa Rica, the problem-solving sort of approach to biology. And so I designed various field problems, and one of the field problems happened to be about monarch butterflies. And once I got into it, I realized that there was very little known about the monarch migration in total, in terms of its dynamics. We knew a little bit about where the monarchs came from that got to Mexico, but we didn't know much else. We didn't know when the migration started. We didn't know when it peaked. We didn't know, we just didn't know anything about the dynamics. We didn't know where most of the monarchs came from that reached Mexico. So the whole idea then just say, hey, wait a minute, let's look at all the data that's out there. And then you look at that and you say, oh my gosh, there are dozens and dozens of questions that haven't been answered. And so, as a scientist, as a field scientist, what you do is you kind of look for those things that you can plug into and get a sense of, with your own abilities and those of your colleagues, as to whether you can answer the questions. And it appeared that we could answer a lot of the basic questions about monarch population dynamics if we stuck with it long enough, and if we developed a program that was big enough to get the data that we needed, which is data from the entire country. So we have had people tagging butterflies all over the eastern United States, from the Rocky Mountains down to Florida, and basically from the Rockies, from the Divide, through Montana, through New Mexico, and then all the way to the East Coast. And that has produced a lot of information about the variability of this migration across the continent. And then, of course, you want to know something about the variability among years. I mean, just like we've talked about in the past with honeybees, you want to know why honey production is up some years and not others. And it's complicated, and everything that the monarchs do is complicated. So in order to really piece together what's going on with a population like this, you have to have decades of data, and now we've got it.
Hey, Chip, I'll ask a basic question because I just didn't know. When the butterflies that arrive in Mexico, are they the same butterflies that left Ohio that summer, or is it generations that make it the trip down? Is it a single butterfly that makes that migration?
Yeah, here's the amazing thing, Jeff. Here's the amazing thing. A butterfly from Nova Scotia can fly to Mexico all by itself, overwinter in Mexico for 5 months, come back and lay eggs in Texas until it dies. It's a two-way migration, but it's not complete two-way. It's all the way down, one generation, well, most of the way back in the spring, if they survive the winter, if they survive on the way down. So the idea is to, try to figure out the survival rate of things that originate from different places, their overwintering possibilities, their return possibilities, and that the whole dynamics of that process. And of course, that involves, the whole migration itself starts at the very northern point, starts about the first week of August, say in Winnipeg. It takes those butterflies 2.5 months to get to Mexico. So you're going from, and then when they're coming back out of Mexico, it's March, right? And they're probably dead. They're all dead by the 1st of May, most years. So think of that. You got 5 months in the following year, and you've got probably, 4 or 5 months in the previous year. So a lot of these monarchs that are surviving the whole process are living 8 or 9 months, and that's just remarkable. And it's one generation.
Do you know from your research yet that the offspring from the butterfly who laid eggs in Texas, whether its offspring actually return like to Nova Scotia, or do they stop wherever they stop along the way?
Yeah, that's kind of dictated by the weather, we think. That they're not going back to Nova Scotia because Mama may come back to Texas, or she may go to Louisiana, and she may end up going along coastal Georgia, and or a butterfly that originated in Minnesota might come back and go to Georgia. We don't know whether they are divergent when they're returning, but it's probable that they are. And they don't get back, except very, very rarely would any one of these butterflies get back to where it originated. It'd be extraordinarily rare. It'd probably have to be a butterfly coming out of Oklahoma getting back to Oklahoma. That would probably be about the only case I can imagine happening. Anyway, it's a pretty dynamic and extraordinary process, right?
You're finding out all this because of the tags. Somebody tags a butterfly in Nova Scotia and somebody finds it and lets it go.
Yeah, what generally happens is that most of this is inferential, but it comes off of butterflies that are collected dead at the overwintering sites in Mexico. So there's quite a bit of attrition at the overwintering sites. And underneath these massive clusters of butterflies, the dead butterflies drift down. And the people who are at those sites, they scour the forest floor below those clusters, and they turn over the butterflies, and every once in a while, maybe every 3 or 4 days of doing this, shuffling their feet or looking or just passing by, they'll spot a tag, and they save those tags. And then we send people down to Mexico. They're usually people that are working with us, send people to Mexico to buy the tags from the guides. And they keep these tags in their wallets. And our people come by and announce that they will buy tags. And these people show up and they sell the tags to the people that we've sent down there. I send a lot of money down there to buy tags. And we pay $5 for every one of the tags that are recovered, because it's not trivial to find these tags. It takes a fair amount of looking and saving and what have you. So, and $5 is about half a day's pay for most of these people down there. But here's the deal. There's about 20, maybe 30, maybe 40,000 untagged butterflies for every tag. So it's, it involves a fair amount of effort to find a tag and to save a tag. And so we reward that. That provides the data that we need. It's provided almost entirely, not exclusively, but almost entirely from dead butterflies. And that tells us quite a bit. But there are other sources of data. So there's a website called Journey North, which records a lot of data on monarchs, which is, say, first sighting data, first egg data, first milkweed out of the ground data, that sort of thing. All this sort of phenological stuff, which we can also piece together with all the tagging data. And one of the interesting things about this tagging data is that one of the things we discovered fairly early on was that this migration is not a random event. The migration is actually tied into celestial changes. And the migrations in the purest form, in the best years, the most average temperatures, move at a regular pace. And that pace is coincident with the declining angle of the sun at solar noon. Holy smoke, the sun is declining in the fall. And the sun is declining in the fall, and the monarchs start the migration at or about the time that the declining angle of the sun in the late summer reaches an angle of 57. And if you look at the front of this migration, time after time after time, the leading edge of the migration across all the latitudes is 57. And the trailing edge is something like about 46, because the sun is continuing to decline. All right. So kind of the way I got onto this was that I was working with another fellow by the name of David Jabot, who's done a lot of work with wasps and so on. And he was a glider pilot. And I called him up one day. I said, David, I'm seeing some regularity in this migration movement. It seems to be predictable. I want to know how to find a website. Tell me if there was a website where I can figure out the angle of the sun at solar noon. Well, he gave me that website. And I said, oh my gosh, this is all falling into place. The migration starts in Winnipeg almost the same day every year. And they end up reaching Mexico at almost the same day every year. In other words, they start in the first week of August in Winnipeg, and they end up reaching Mexico in the last 3 days of October almost every single year. Well, how is that possible? And if you look at the data, it says the angle of the sun at solar noon for both the time of their leaving Winnipeg and the time that they are arriving at the overwintering sites is 57. So it's taken us, the better part of a decade and a half to nail that all down. But that doesn't mean that they do that every year. And so one of the things that we realize now is that the weather delays the migration, but it never speeds it up. It may never go faster than the sun angle at solar noon. Yeah, so it's pretty cute, and it's challenging to figure this out.
That raises a question, of course. How many miles a day is a butterfly flying?
Yeah. Well, of course it varies, and lots of times they'll sit for 3 days if the weather isn't good. But if the weather is good, and let's say there's no wind-aided movement, there's no winds from the northwest, for example, they're moving somewhere around 30 to possibly 40
Holy
miles a
cow.
day. And they're probably moving at average speeds of 8 to 10 miles an hour. So that tells you, how many hours of flight there are. So the butterfly's got a task. It's got to wake up in the morning. It's got to feed a little bit. It's got to get on the road, so to speak. It's got to fly for 4 or 5 hours, maybe more. And then it's got to feed some more. And then it's got to find a place to hang up at night, because they roost in the trees at the end of the day. So that's the life of these migratory monarchs, except when a northwesterly comes through. And then when a northwesterly comes through, they'll get up on a thermal and ride that northwesterly as fast as they can. And in some cases, they'll move 100 miles or even more in a day.
If they can catch a thermal and they go 100 miles, do they stay for a couple days when they land, or do they just get to their final destination early?
Well, what the northwesterlies do is they push them southeast. And that puts them off their track.
Okay.
So you don't want to be pushed too far off track, right? You don't want to be pushed too far off your track. So what we think happens is that they reorient after they get pushed to the southeast. But we have some data on that, but it isn't published yet. But it looks like they acquire local information and reset their compass heading. And they're responding to a lot of different things. They're responding to a lot of celestial information, and they're probably responding to the magnetic fields. And this is how their navigation is pretty doggone complex, but they have a pretty sweet system of being able to read the environment and use that read of the environment to orient in a way that has the effect of getting them to Mexico. Now I'll give you one example of what has happened in the tagging records. We had a butterfly tagged in the Kansas City area that was apparently picked up on a northwesterly. It ended up on the coast of Alabama and Dauphin Island 3 days later, 700 miles away. Now that's extreme, but it tells you what can happen.
What's the status right now? What are the numbers, and why are they all changing?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. It's one that's vexing a lot of people because we had an extremely low population at the overwintering sites in 2013. So let me just give you kind of a brief history. If this whole thing of monitoring the overwintering sites started in 1994. At least it was the most comprehensive start that we had was in 94. There were some measures earlier, but it wasn't comprehensive enough to tell us enough about the population. But in 94, we had a pretty good read on how many monarchs were there, and that is a measure of the number of hectares of trees that the butterflies overwinter in. In other words, they don't count the trees, they measure the basal sort of area of occupation. And then they add that up because there are lots of different colonies. They add that all up and they come up with a number of hectares. They call them, a hectare is about 2.4 acres. They come up with a number of hectares that are occupied of trees that are occupied by the butterflies. Well, that started out in 94 at a pretty good number, and then it went up in 95, and it really went up in 96. It got to about 18 hectares, which probably meant that there was close to 1 billion butterflies down there. But it has oscillated after that. There was a big spring kill in 97. The population was only 5-something hectares. After 96, the population really dropped. And that really got me started on monarch demographics, because I wanted to know why that population had dropped from 18 hectares to 5 hectares. And what I discovered was that there was a weather event that went well into Texas in April of 97, and it froze monarch larvae and eggs all the way down probably into the area of Waco, Texas. So the population had gotten a good start, but it got a kick in the gut because of a late frost that year. Well, then I began to look at what happened every year after that. And what we saw suddenly was that in the early 2000s, the population really began to tank. And I got an email in 2004 from a farmer in Nebraska. And he said, I just want you to know that I've adopted these new Roundup Ready varieties of corn and soybeans. And it's eliminating the milkweeds on my farm in those row crops. And the effect of that is that I'm seeing fewer and fewer monarchs than I ever saw in the past. I just thought you ought to know. And I'm going, oh my gosh. We knew at that time that a lot of monarchs were produced on milkweeds in corn and soybeans. And I'm saying, all right, if that all goes, we're in real trouble. So I started a program in 2005. It was Monarch Watch. We were never very rich, and I still don't have a marketing program. But we started a little program then we called the Monarch Way Station program to get people to try to compensate for what was being lost. And that program started out very slowly because, again, I'm not a marketer and we didn't have a marketing budget and we were just limping along as an organization. But now we have something like 27,000 registered Monarch Way Stations around the country. And these are small gardens that people have created in order to provide habitat for monarch butterflies. But we also have a lot of other programs along the same lines, which are getting a lot more habitat on the ground. And since 2010, after we developed a program which we called the Bring Back the Monarch program, we've distributed 1 million milkweed plugs around the country to virtually, I'm not sure every state, but probably almost every state in the country we've distributed milkweeds to for monarch conservation. 1 million plugs. And that's a start, but it's a drop in the bucket relative to what's needed because we've lost so much habitat. Give you an idea of what's really going on. And the beekeepers are aware of this. The beekeepers know they're losing habitat, right? Everybody knows that. I mean, everybody's kind of scrambling to find those diverse areas where they can maintain bees in the summertime to just get them up to speed so that they can overwinter them. We hear a lot of stories about how people are scrambling to find those sites, and they're talking about where to move them in the mountains or where to move them on federal land and so on and so forth. Well, there's a good reason for that. I mean, there's a lot of habitat degradation going on here, and there's a lot of intensification of agriculture that's putting the beekeepers out of the system. So, one of the things that's going on, and I've been trying to draw attention to this, is that we're losing 1 million acres a year of grassland just due to development of increasing plowed land, increasing cropland. There's consuming 1 million acres of grassland. Well, grassland is habitat for pollinators. It's habitat for monarch butterflies. It's habitat for ground nesting birds. You know the story about the birds, right? The bird thing that came out, I think it was in September last year, where we've lost some incredible proportion of the bird population. And part of that is losing 31 species of grassland birds. And the grassland birds are being lost because of all of the conversion. And then you've got conversion of land just for development as well. And so there's just a tremendous amount of habitat change that's going on in this country. And the beekeepers are aware of this, as I said, and the rest of us are trying to scramble to do something about this and to get the public engaged in recognizing all of this. And it was really nice to see that magazine, 2 Million Blossoms, come out and kind of direct a lot of energy to focusing on that particular issue as well. I mean, we really have to pay attention to what's happening in terms of habitat loss to compensate for that in some way, or we're going to lose monarch butterflies, we're going to lose some of these ground nesting birds, we're going to lose a number of other things out there. So being inattentive is not in our best interest.
Better Bee is pleased to present the Pollinator Week series of interviews on Beekeeping Today podcast. As a supplier to the nation's beekeepers for over 40 years, Better Bee provides the tools, equipment, and information you need to succeed. Through its many beekeeping employees, Better Bee serves you with solutions to your beekeeping challenges. That's why they can say they are your partners in better beekeeping. Thanks to Better Bee for their informative catalog, website, supportive beekeeper education, and for supporting this week's episodes. Be sure to see the latest at betterbee.com.
Chip, one of the last articles I did for Bee Culture magazine before I retired was on farmland loss. In the time of this podcast, we will have lost 20 acres of farmland in this country. That's 20 acres an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That goes with your 1,000,000 acres a year of loss. You're right. Monarchs, birds, bees, and butterflies. So what's the answer?
Yeah, the answer is that we have to step it up, and we have to conserve as much habitat as we possibly can, and we have to engage all of those landowners out there to doing something. I got an email today that from one of my staff members and telling me about a program in Kentucky where there is an organization that's very aggressively looking for land that is unused. Unused in quotes, unused, right? And because it isn't going to be under the plow, it isn't going to be used for anything else in the immediate future. They're spotting these pieces of land. They're approaching the landowners and they're saying, "Hey, we can improve this habitat for you if you just give us access. Give us access to this, and we'll put plants in the ground that'll make this a wonderful place for pollinators, for birds, for butterflies, for monarchs, and so on and so forth." And the bottom line here was, and I've got to call this guy because I just heard about it today. The bottom line is, he said, nobody's ever turned us down. So we need that kind of a program all over the country. We need people out there who are taking command locally, who are saying, "Hey, we've got to maintain the integrity of the system. We have to maintain the integrity of the system by providing the habitat that all these species needs. And it's not hard to do, and we still have enough habitat so we can do it. What it takes is an initiative. It takes implementation. It takes a little planning. It takes some plant production. And it takes some volunteers to step up and get these plants on the ground. And a lot of people are willing to do it. I mean, we've distributed tens of thousands of plants to particular programs that mobilize the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or both to plant milkweeds along trails in Nebraska or at farm edges in Iowa. It can be done, and it has to be done. Otherwise, we're going to lose these things that we value and these things that keep everything connected. It's just not in our best interest to fool with Mother Nature to the point where we destroy everything. That doesn't serve us well.
Are those what you're talking about? The volunteer usage of land, is that similar to the Monarch Way Station program that you referred to earlier?
Yeah. So most of the Monarch Way Station stuff is at schools. Everything: schools, businesses, corporations, backyards. I think 10% of them are in schools. Probably 40 or 50% of them are at homes. And then the rest breaks down to all sorts of other things. And 27,000 of these. And, the thing is that as a concept, creating habitat this way has extended outside of this country. In Mexico, it's in some of the Caribbean islands, it's in Australia. It's in India. I mean, we have Monarch Way Stations in several different parts of the world because people have said, "Hey, we don't have monarchs necessarily, but the idea of creating a habitat is a good one." And so this is kind of branded and it's kind of spreading around the world. And I think we have 5 foreign countries where we have Monarch Way Stations. So, this is something we generally have to do on a worldwide basis. We have to recognize what's valuable out there. We have to recognize how to deal with the loss and compensate for it. It's a mitigation plan.
You mentioned earlier that part of what you're doing is giving milkweed plugs to plant, and that has to have a cost to produce, right?
Right.
But can't I just harvest a milkweed pod, let the seeds dry, and plant them myself?
Kim, you can do that. But your success rate will be really low, and it's because these seeds require stratification, which means that they have to be cold treated in a sterile environment, a moist cold treated in a sterile environment for 30 days. Then you plant the seeds. Then you have to grow them out. You're going to have to grow them out for about 3 months to get them to the plug stage. Now you can do that. It's a fair amount of work, and it takes a good propagator to do it, which is why we work with 5 nurseries around the country that are really good at this sort of thing. We have them producing tens of thousands of plants in various nurseries at different places in the country, and it helps to have a good propagator. But as I know you, Kim, and I know you're a good propagator, but getting seeds in the ground and scratching the ground and covering them up with a little dirt, you'll probably get about 0.5% take. In other words, there's a lot of mortality of that seed out there once it hits the ground. I can see that. And
wow,
yeah, and so so this is why we stick with plugs. Now, a lot of other people go with seeds. Seeds are fine. I don't have any objection to them, but you're not going to get the immediate benefit that you do with plugs. You're right about a couple of things. We have to have help doing this. So we have help from the NRDC, National Resource Defense Council, and they give us money to distribute flats of milkweed plugs to schools all over the country. And we do that. We distribute to schools and nonprofits, maybe about 180 of them every year, with the support from the NRDC. And what happens there is they put these plants in the ground in the spring, and by fall, they've got caterpillars on them. And the kids love it, right? I mean, we've got a lot of real positive feedback because you got an instantaneous thing. You're not going to do that with seeds. That's just not going to work that well or that fast with seeds. The other program that we have is a free milkweeds for restoration program, which is, again, underwritten by industry, in this case by Monsanto and then Bayer. They have provided us with the resources in past years, to distribute 100,000 milkweed plugs each of the last 4 years. And that is terrific. I mean, because it gets a lot of plants in the ground. It allows us to get involved with some really big projects. But you're right. I mean, in order to get this program going at an even higher level, we're going to have corporate and NGO support, because we don't have that kind of support. I mean, we're not that big an organization. There is a cost involved. What I have to do when I distribute plants is that I have to have just enough of the cost for those plants as a nonprofit to keep staff going so they can handle the orders. But otherwise, we don't make any money on these plants at all. We're simply operate as a nonprofit. We work with whoever will supply us money so that we can get contracts going with the nurseries so they can grow the plants, so that we can get the plants distributed. And of course, we got a marketing problem then. And I'm always more enthusiastic about getting milkweeds in the ground than my staff thinks I ought to be, and therefore we end up with some problems sometimes, overproducing plants, and we have to bite the bullet when we overproduce. But we haven't had too much of that.
I'd also guess you want these plugs in strategic places. Some would be more profitable in terms of monarch support than other places, right? So you probably are looking at an alleyway going from north to south that you would much rather send plugs to than some places where monarchs don't go. So are you aiming your marketing at those better places?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's take a look at I-35 on a map sometime. It goes from Duluth all the way down to the border with Texas and Mexico. That's where most of the monarchs come from. There's a central flyway, and this is where the tagging comes in. Really, really valuable. The tagging shows us that most of the monarchs that reach Mexico come out of that corridor. We got a lot of monarchs produced elsewhere in the country, but their success rate of getting to Mexico is a lot less than through that central corridor. So that's, I mean, you're absolutely right. There are priorities in terms of where we need to put that milkweed, and that priority is in the most intensively farmed area in the country, in the Midwest at least.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Oh, that's got to be tough. Well, for those of you listening out there that live within 10 miles of I-35, here's your chance to go out and do something good, I guess.
Is the milkweed an annual or perennial?
These are all perennial plants. These are all native perennial plants. There's at least 76, maybe 105, depending upon who you talk to, milkweed species in the U.S. And I count them as about 76 milkweed species in the U.S. They're very diverse, but the monarchs are using, and the monarchs we know are using at least 30 of them, but there are probably 10 species in total that constitute, 98% of the monarchs produced, about 10 species. I mean, you're familiar with some of them. There's common milkweed, there's swamp milkweed, there's butterfly milkweed. These are all eastern U.S. Species. You go down to Florida, you got another species, which is called aquatic milkweed, which is Asclepias perennis. And then you go out to California, you get a whole new suite of species. So yeah, we've got a lot of diversity out there. There are two main species that monarchs are dependent on. The main one for the fall generation is the common milkweed, which is very common. This is what Kim is talking about, collecting seeds of. That's very common in the northern half of the eastern part of the U.S. And then there's another species that is common from Texas all the way up into Kansas, and that's the green antelope horn milkweed. So there you got two milkweeds that the monarchs are primarily dependent on. One of which is that first generation comes in and lays eggs, most of their eggs on two species in Texas and in Oklahoma. And then that generation that moves north from those eggs that are first laid by the butterflies coming back from Mexico, that generation goes north, and then it produces additional generations on other milkweed species, particularly common milkweed.
I've been raising milkweeds for about 30 years where I live, and I'll get several hundred plants every year. And I see a fair population of butterflies on those milkweeds during the summer, but rarely monarchs. So I'm probably not in a major flyway, but for those that pass over, lunch is ready.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's very kind of you, Kim. You're doing your job, and we monarchs appreciate it. We appreciate it here at Monarch Watch. But it's an interesting thing. And if you've got a lot of milkweeds, you can get milkweed honey. Milkweed is a really good honey plant. And one of the sad things about this adoption of Roundup Ready corn and soybeans is the elimination of what's called blue vine or sand vine. You familiar with that? Blue vine, sand vine, a honey vine?
I'm not. No.
Oh, it grows all over fences. It grows on juniper shrubs. It grows in cornfields. And we used to produce blue vine honey here in Kansas. And we produced that because it was very common in cornfields. Once they had Roundup Ready corn and soybeans, it eliminated the blue vine, and we could no longer produce that honey. And that honey was a beautiful, rich honey, but it had one of the interesting qualities that honey gets every once in a while. It had a kind of an oil-like sheen to it, a kind of a greenish sheen. There aren't very many honeys that give you this kind of reflection back again, but this honey did, and it was very distinct. It was very distinctive, and we could produce a lot of it because there was a lot of that blue vine growing in cornfields. I once got a call from a farmer who said, I don't understand what's going on. I've got monarch chrysalises all over my corn. How is that possible? Are they feeding on the corn? I said, no, they're not feeding on the corn. They're feeding on the blue vine. And you've got blue vine in your fields. They're feeding on the milkweeds that are in your fields. He said, I don't have any milkweeds in the field. I said, yes, you do. You got milkweeds in your field. That's growing all over your corn. And he said, no, that's not. That's not milkweed. That's bindweed. I said, no, that's not bindweed. Look for the pods. It's got these great big pods. All right. Okay. Now you know what I'm talking about. Now you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yep.
I know monarchs go to flowers other than milkweeds, and milkweeds are the larva food predominantly.
Right.
But is there anything they like to go to? The adults on the routes, north and south.
Well, the big nectar plants for a lot of butterflies are all of your composites, your sunflower family plants, your asters, your echinaceas, things of that sort, your New England asters, your white asters in the fall. There are a whole series of aster species and ageratums and things of that sort. They'll go to all of those composites if they're nectivorous. But they also like mints. There are a bunch of mints that are pretty good. But it's mostly concentrating on the composites, the sunflower family. Those are the best plants, and so there's a whole lot of them. And if people are interested in the kinds of plants that are available for this type of thing, we sell a lot of them at our spring open house, which we're trying to arrange now. Of course, it's been canceled, but we generally sell about 8,000 plants, so we're trying to sell them all online this year. But we have a list that's on our website, which will show a lot of these nectar plants and tell you whether they're annuals or perennials and that sort of thing. So people can find good lists of plants to plant, whether they're natives or cultivars that they can use for gardens to attract butterflies.
I could be doing both then, growing milkweeds on my spare land and have some other flowers in my gardens for the adults as they move through. And all of these are good for both bees and butterflies.
Right, that's right. That's right. Yeah, you can enjoy the whole
Sounds like a win-win to me.
Absolutely a win-win. It's a field of dreams scenario. You create it and they will come. I mean, they may not come tomorrow, but they'll come eventually.
There you
go. They'll come there.
You mentioned selling things online. We're going to have that information on our webpage,
yes.
Jeff?
We'll have Chip's contact information for the Monarch Watch and all the programs he's talked about. We'll have those in our show notes. Chip, is there anything that you want to tell us that we haven't asked you about yet?
Yeah, there's just
it's a big topic, I know.
Yeah, there's a number of things that they have to go on. I mean, one of the topics that always comes up with regard to beekeeping and monarch butterflies and everything else is what's the world going to look like in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road, right? And nobody really wants to talk about it, but I spent a lot of time talking about it and thinking about it, and that has to do with climate change. Right, the climate is changing. I mean, we can see that in the monarch data. We can see that in the monarch data from the West Coast. We can probably see that if we look hard enough in the honeybee data. I mean, that's part of what's going on in the honeybee data. I mean, we know that as temperatures go up, nectar secretion becomes more difficult for the plants. There is a concentration of nectar that is produced that is a function of the day-night difference. There's a difference between daytime gross productivity and what we end up with net productivity. So in the daytime, the plants acquire energy by synthesizing sugars through photosynthesis. But at night, a lot of that is broken down through respiration. And one of the conundrums that we're faced with is as temperatures go down, as temperatures go up, the day-night difference becomes smaller and smaller. In other words, the respiratory part of that system increases, and that equation increases, which means that your net productivity goes down. And when your net productivity goes down, we can see it with honeybees, we can see it with nectar production, we can see, and there's studies about this around the world, the nectar secretion can go down, and that's going to have an impact on everything. There's a really neat little study that came out of Colorado indicating that some of these plants or some of these insects are so narrowly tied to the nectar that is produced by specific plants that if that nectar goes down, the population of that particular insect goes down the following year. So there's a cascade of effects that occur as a function of increasing temperatures that we don't fully appreciate yet, but we're going to have to, because this is coming crashing down on us and it's going to increase. And the net effect of this is going to be that, by somewhere in the mid 2040s, we're going to be at 500 parts per million as far as CO2 is concerned. And everything is going to be changed at that time. I mean, we may not even be talking about monarch butterflies at that time because they'll be pushed off the mountains in Mexico. I mean, this is a reality that we really have to think about and we have to plan for. And one of the things that, I'm doing with regard to monarchs is saying, monarchs are an organism whose status is telling us something about our neglect with respect to the environment. If we value these butterflies, if we value a lot of these things out there, then we have to pay attention to the fact that the climate is changing and we have to do something about it. We have to address that. I'm not a climate scientist, so I can't get up there and beat the drum and say, listen up, everybody. Things are changing and they're going to be quite negative and the future is not going to be the same. But I can tell that story with regard to monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies, we can see in the data, are going to go down. Honeybees and native pollinators are going to go down as these things change. One of the articles I'm thinking of writing has to do with looking at the demography of these insects as a function of increasing temperature. A lot of species are so narrowly adapted that as the temperature goes up, their reproductive rate goes down. And as the temperatures continue to go up, their ability to replace themselves continues to go down. So, we don't have enough basic data on how populations work, but it looks like one of the things we're going to have to learn is how to get those data to really understand the changes that are going to occur as a result of increasing temperatures. Anyway, this is a platform that I'm on that I preach about a lot, but I think there's a reality. I mean, what CO2 is doing, what nitrous oxides are doing, what methane is doing. I mean, this is all predictable. It's like looking at these COVID-19 curves, right? There's a lot of predictability in those curves, and there's a lot of predictability in what is happening with greenhouse gases, and we're not paying enough attention.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked, Jeff. That was a good message. And
Yeah,
that was a good message, and you're exactly right. It's beekeepers always say that honeybees are the canary in the coal mine, but I think you've got another one out there with the monarchs and the population dynamics that are going on because of all the other things that we're doing to the world.
All right. Chip Taylor, it's been a pleasure having you on the Beekeeping Today podcast during Pollinator Week, and would look forward to having you back again and talking about your experience with honeybees and the Africanized honeybees as they were coming up through the tropics. I'm sure you have a couple stories there.
I'm glad you could join us today, Chip. Thank you for your time.
I'm glad to be here. We'll talk to you again.
Okay.
All right.
Take care.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Stay safe and stay well, everybody.
Well, I told you that was going to be fun.
Yeah.
He rolls more things into monarchs than I possibly can imagine. How fast they fly, how far they fly in a day, 30 to 40 miles in a day. A monarch butterfly. I can't even walk that far in a day, let alone fly. I'm married. And then the thermals that he was talking about, you get a couple 300 miles a day when they're riding a thermal. I was impressed with how they've managed to do that. And the other thing that really scary, the climate change effects. I would have never would have dawned on me that but the chemistry of temperature and nectar. Boy, that's a dead ringer for bad news for a monarch and for all of us, really. But something as small and as fragile as a monarch, suddenly, if you reduce the amount of nectar in those flowers by a half of a percentage point, suddenly there's not enough, and monarchs are in trouble. We got a lot to do.
Yeah.
We got a lot of stuff we got to take care of.
He's talking about the loss of habitat, and you think about, well, it's just, some milkweed. It's easy to think, well, it's just a milkweed. But it's really more than just a milkweed. It's a stop along the way. It's a continuance of life in that circle that's been going on for such a long time. It's so important. And so I'm glad he was able to bring that to our attention.
Yeah. I knew that losing milkweeds in cornfields was a big factor in monarch population problems, but I didn't realize how big it was. And he brought up loss of habitat. We did that story, losing 20 acres an hour. The hour that we've been here today, 20 acres of farmland someplace disappeared.
Wow. That's really sobering, that's for sure. Well, the bright side is he did give us avenues to and means to support and help the monarch, both through the Monarch Watch program. Pollinator Partnership also has a monarch program in place, and anybody who lives along the line of the monarch migration path, just planting a couple plugs of those milkweed plants, you can help.
Well, who's tomorrow, Jeff?
Good question, Kim. Tomorrow is Andoni Melithopoulos from the Oregon State Agriculture Extension Service.
Oh, yeah. But do you remember, have you ever listened to I was on his podcast, Pollination, a while back. And I look forward to talking to him again. He's got some interesting things going on that I don't think anybody else is doing. So it should be fun.
Yeah, it will be. And I did listen to that podcast. You were phenomenal there. It was a good start to your podcasting career here. So it's no, Andoni's really good, and our listeners should tune in tomorrow.
All right.
That about wraps it up for this podcast. Before we go, I want to encourage our listeners to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, wherever you download and stream the show. Your vote helps other beekeepers find us quicker. We want to thank Pollinator Week sponsor, Better Bee, for sponsoring this week's specials. You can find them at www.betterbee.com. As always, we thank Bee Culture, the magazine for American beekeeping, for their continued sponsorship of Beekeeping Today podcast as we head off into our 3rd season. We want to thank our regular episode sponsor, Global Patties. Check them out at www.globalpatties.com. And finally, we want to thank you, the Beekeeping Today podcast listener, for joining us on this show. Feel free to send us questions and comments to questions@beekeepingtodaypodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. Anything else we should mention, Kim?
I think that's it. Don't forget to watch the Pollinator movie, and we'll see you tomorrow.
All right. See you then.